значення, інструменталізацію до якоїсь міри цієї церкви у Росії. Please, now floor is yours.
So, first of all, I want to thank you very much for the invitation to present my project here at the CU. It's the first time I'm visiting the campus and I'm very impressed. I also want to thank Jose for having the idea that we should have this meeting. And I'm very glad about this opportunity to present a research project that I've been working on for the last years, but which in reality goes back also to research I did previously. And what I want to do today is basically present that part of the research, of the empirical research that concerns the Russian Orthodox Church and how it uses its external policy capacity to advance what I call the traditionalist agenda, which has really become sort of the foreign policy principle in the last 7 years, I would say. I also want to say, before I start, that probably I'm not telling you anything much new, and I'm also here to learn from you and from the knowledge you have, also from really from the past in a way, of whether you see anything new in what I'm telling you, or whether you see just a continuity between a type of a Soviet times type of instrumentalization of religion in the Russian space, or whether you think there's actually something new. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Now, first of all, on the post-secular conflicts project. This is a project that wants to explore the agenda and the transnational networks of moral conservative actors and the role of the Russian Orthodox Church therein, in these networks, with regard to 3 main areas where religious moral conflicts emerge. These are the 3 main areas which the traditionalist agenda, as I will call it today, covers. Religious freedom, so questions regarding religious symbols in the public spheres, free speech, free exercise. Family, questions regarding gender and generational equality, and life. These are questions regarding bioethical issues, challenges in biotechnology, also abortion, for example, falls into this. So around these topics, societies and the international civil society mobilizes. So politics mobilizes in the transnational space, and that's what I want to look at. Where does this take place? This mobilization. I look at 4 fora. The United Nations, the Council of Europe, with the European Council of Human Rights, the official church relations, so in ecumenical activities, and in transnational civil society. And the 2 points I've put in bold here are the ones that I will look at today. So the United Nations and the Council of Europe, and official church relations and ecumenical activities. Before I start, very quickly an overview over the theme of the research project, because obviously I'm not alone looking at all this material. I have collaborators. One of them is from Russia, Dmitry Uslana. Maybe you have heard about the journal Государственная Церковь Российской Рубежи. He is the editor of that journal. Then I have a number of other researchers, and from Russia I collaborated for some time with Sergei Chapnin, who came and visited the project for 6 months, and also with Boris Knorre, who's a sociologist of religion from the Higher School of Economics. So first of all, just a quick word on terminology. The word norm entrepreneur or moral norm entrepreneur is really a terminology that comes from international relations studies. Thank you. From international relations studies. It means that you get in international politics individuals or organizations that take it upon itself to change the way certain issues are seen and evaluated. A classical example for norm protagonism or norm entrepreneurship was the Red Cross, the emergence of the Red Cross. So before the Red Cross came into existence, the assistance to wounded civilians in war areas was not the task of anybody really. There was no organization that was doing that. So there was an individual, the founder of the Red Cross, who realized that there is a need to do something, and so once the problem was identified, an organization and norm, also the norm not to harm civilians in situations of war and to help civilians in situations of war, emerged. So the norm entrepreneurship theory therefore very much looked at progressive values. It was so the idea in a way was it was really norms that identify a problem and then propose solutions. And I argued in an article that this is in a way a blind spot of the norm entrepreneurship theory, because we can also have conservative norm entrepreneurs or illiberal norm entrepreneurs. And the theory also applies to them, the way it has been worked out, because the idea behind of moral norm entrepreneurship is that we get a norm protagonist, an individual or an organization that identifies an issue. This individual needs an organizational platform. That is the venue where a particular issue is promoted, that the policy, the field where promoted. And in order to be successful, a norm protagonist needs a supporting state actor. This is a country that gives support to the norm protagonist. Think about the Red Cross, it was Switzerland, so I'm in a very placative way. Now, I think in terms of when we look at the Russian Orthodox Church as an illiberal norm entrepreneur, clearly the churches of the norm protagonist, the organizational platform are various ones, but today I will look at the United Nations Human Rights Council and at the Council of Europe. And the supporting state actor is Russian state diplomacy. What I will show now, though, is that the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state diplomacy, they sometimes seem to switch roles. So it's not always the same who takes the lead, which really is for me an indicator of very close coordination. So the starting point for this research is really a book I wrote in 2014. It's called The Russian Orthodox Church and Human Rights. And in this study, I looked at the way the Russian Orthodox Church developed its teaching on human rights from roughly basically from the fall of the Soviet Union from 1991 until 2008, when the Church published a document called the Russian Orthodox Church Basic Teaching on Human Dignity, Freedom and Rights. And in this doctrine, we read, the Church, on the basis of Holy Scriptures and the Holy Tradition, has to assess the theory of human rights and its implementation. And it also says the document is offered to the fraternal attention of local Orthodox churches in the hope that it will help our churches to grow in unity and coordinate their practical actions. So this was the rhetoric of the Moscow Patriarchate in 2008 regarding human rights. In the book, I identify a timeline of how the Russian Orthodox Church changed its attitude on human rights. I will just talk you through this very quickly. So in the year 2000, when the basis of the social concept of the Orthodox Church was published, human rights did not play an important role in the text, and at that point in the text where they are mentioned, they're basically rejected as the result of Western civilization, Enlightenment theory, which is not the tradition that the Orthodox Church shares. So they're rejected as a product of an anthropocentric worldview. Then comes in 2008 the Human Rights Declaration of the World Russian People's Council, the Всемирный Русский Народный Собор. I will talk about this organization later on. This text in 2006 came across as it was a very anti-Western formulation, basically also again saying that human rights are something that can do harm to religion, to individuals and so on. It introduced a very profound distinction between human dignity and human worth. And then it was followed in 2006 by an official teaching of the Russian Orthodox Church. So what was a puzzle for me in that study was what happened between 2006 and 2008. And during my fieldwork at the time, I worked with interviews, so I talked to people who were involved in drafting these documents. And one person who talked to me a lot at the time, because he was still in Moscow at the time, was Cyril Kavarun. And he told me very clearly in recalling, he said, the declaration of the World Russian People's Council was a terrible mistake, and they made a huge mistake, a theological mistake, when they made this distinction between human worth and human dignity, and we had to correct that. And the 2008 document, actually, that part on human dignity was written by Kavarun, and it really corrects that error, so to speak. But of course, the document had many authors, and one of the authors, for example, was Joplin, and so there's a whole part on human rights and the Orthodox nation and the state, which has not really changed this in a very illiberal view of human rights and human freedom and so on. So the 2008 document is not of one piece. It has many different sections. So some of them are a success and some of them are not. What basically happened, though, is that this 2008 document never really played any important role. It's kind of forgotten. And why is it kind of forgotten? Because what came out of it was not a discourse on human rights, but what came out of it was a discourse on traditional values. And why did this happen? So from 2006 onwards, as the Church was working on the human rights document, I think you can really see, reading the documents, that a lot of expertise was acquired on the responsible people inside the Moscow Patriarchate. They did learn about human rights discourse, the development of human rights instruments. And in 2006, a new argument appears, which is a real puzzle. Metropolitan Kirill at the time starts to quote repeatedly Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So what is Article 29? It's here in the box. It says, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law, solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. This is Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It has been called also the limitation clause. The European Convention of Human Rights has similar formulations. And they basically, yes, they impose a kind of limit to the realization of human rights in a democratic society. So what does the Russian Orthodox Church do? It picks up on this clause and it drops in a democratic society. It picks up on the term morality and it adds traditional. So if we look at these two quotes by Kirill, he says, I'm convinced that the concern for spiritual needs, based moreover on traditional morality, ought to return to the public realm. The upholding of moral standards must become a social cause. It is the mechanism of human rights that can actively enable this return. I'm speaking of a return, for the norm of according human rights with traditional morality can be found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Or another quote, the Orthodox Church invites the world to return to the understanding of the role of human rights in social life that was established in 1948. Moral rules can put limits to the realization of human rights in public life. So it's a kind of trick they do. Right? So it's a deliberate misreading in a way of Article 29, which says in a democratic society, which basically, what does that mean? It means that standards of morality can change as society changes and evolves. So this dynamic idea of morality in a democratic society is completely dropped and becomes a static idea of morality tied to tradition and history. And the Russian Orthodox Church, though, has come a long way from 2000, when the social doctrine of human rights are rejected, to 2006-07, so very short time really, where they say, no, we are in favor of human rights, but in favor of human rights of the 50s. Now, I think it's important to remember that the context in which the Russian Orthodox Church is making such claims is a context of contested human rights. So it's not the Russians who come up with this for the first time. Human rights are constantly contested between a progressivist, universalist, and individualist understanding of human rights and a conservative, contextualist, and a collectivist understanding of human rights. This has been the case ever since the Declaration was signed and UN institutions started to work. Forces that have been associated with conservative contextualist arguments have always been sort of the countries of the Islamic cooperation. Remember, these were countries that for a long time pushed to introduce clauses that would prevent blasphemy in the human rights context. So, whereas the progressive universalist line has always been associated with Western liberal democracies, now very much with the EU, but also with UN institutions themselves and many government agencies. So, the Russian Orthodox Church inscribes itself into a context that already exists. And the example I will show in a minute makes that very clear. So I want to give you two examples. The first one is Russia's traditional values agenda in the United Nations, and the second is the Council of Europe. The first one is actually research that has already been published with researcher Medvedev Ksenia, and it's called Double Bind at the UN. And I want to quickly talk you through that study. In 2009, so 1 year after the publication of the Universal Declaration, of the Russian Declaration of Human Rights, Russia puts up a resolution in the United Nations Human Rights Council, which has its seat in Geneva, entitled Promoting Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms Through a Better Understanding of Traditional Values of Humankind. Then in 2014, Russia becomes the promoter of a set of resolutions entitled Protection of the Family. I will not speak about the family, I only want to talk about the traditional values today. You will already have heard from the term that the traditional values resolution came straight out of the Moscow Patriarchate's document on human rights. I mean, parts of it really appeared kind of copy-paste. And especially this one, the resolution 16 says, dignity, freedom, and responsibility are traditional values. It doesn't make that much sense, right? But the declaration is on human dignity, freedom, and rights. And so what happens when a resolution is brought into the Human Rights Council at the UN? What happens is that countries vote, then they usually decide to do something, so they indicate a rapporteur who has to write a report. Sometimes they organize a seminar, as happened in this case. And so for several sessions, maybe 2-3 years, every now and then they will discuss the resolution. So not that much happens, but a lot of text is produced. And if you study the text, what is very interesting is that there are continuously moments where the Russian Orthodox Church enters into the production of these texts. So when the seminar is organized in Geneva, participants at the seminar on traditional values are representatives from the Russian Orthodox Church, especially the Philippe Levy, who is the representative of the church in Strasbourg. You see him here in the picture. And then the Russian rapporteur for the resolution was the diplomat at the time, Vladimir Kartashkin. And here you see him on this picture. He receives a Medal of Honor of the Russian Orthodox Church, handed to him by Philippe Levy in concomitance with the workshop that is being organized. So the dates coincide. So he was in Strasbourg at the time, he got this order, and then they also did this workshop at the UN. And the report, in the report, I give you this quote. So the report says, any society or state, the report states, has a system of law, obligation, responsibility, without which the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual cannot be guaranteed. This close link is underlined in Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So he repeats the argument that we have already heard from Turey and others. Now, what is very interesting is that the UN Human Rights Council completely makes this report collapse. So it fails. I won't explain in detail how it fails. We described it in the article. But what I wanted to show here is that we see very clearly kind of an enormous entrepreneurship by the Russian Orthodox Church that moves into the United Nations Human Rights Council, and as I said, it fails. But what is also important to consider is that, again, I say the Russian Orthodox Church and Russia puts itself into a context that already exists, because this kind of resolution gathers a lot of consensus. So all the countries that are here indicated with green voted in favor of the resolution. And the ones that are in red voted against. And then you have these countries who abstained, among them Ukraine. And so in that sense, you see that in the UN context, this human rights agenda is actually majoritarian. And it puts the EU and Western European, Western countries, many countries on the defensive. I mean, this is the United States at the time of Barack Obama. And so obviously the US is votes with the EU. I mean, now we have the United States of Trump, and also the diplomatic staff at the UN has in part been changed. And I think the US is actually now much more in support also of a very conservative and restrictive human rights policy. So who knows?
I mean, you know, the government of Pompeo and the formation of a committee to revise the human rights discourse.
Exactly.
Right now.
Yeah. And
Right
I
now.
think this revision is very much along those lines.
Although it's implied, it's a revision to go back to the founding principles of the United States, not the way it has been interpreted. So
Okay.
this is the claim, that we are going back to the original discourse of human rights in the United States, not to the global agenda.
Okay, not the global agenda, yes. Okay, so this was at the UN. Now I want to give you a second example, and this is Russia's traditional values agenda at the Council of Europe. This is a publication that is in preparation. And just to briefly remind you of the context, I don't think that here in Ukraine I have to remind you of the context very much. But so Russia became a member of the Council of Europe in 1996. And then there was a break in participation in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, when the Council of Europe withdrew voting rights from the Russian delegation. But you also know that in spring this year, the activities resumed, and Russia is now again an active member in the Council of Europe and in the Parliamentary Assembly. And maybe, especially in this very moment, it's interesting to actually look at what they did until 2014, some of the initiatives they undertook. So I think a finding definitely is that Russia is using the Council of Europe as a forum to advance its traditionalist agenda. And how does it do that? It's not only by pushing classical topics on the traditionalist agenda, but it's also by reversing topics on the progressive agenda, and in a very clever way. Clever in a way, unfortunate, but in a clever way. And the other important thing is, and I want to go deeper into that for the research we are preparing, is that I think the Council of Europe, and especially the Parliamentary Assembly, is underestimated as a place for networking for parliamentarians and political groups across Europe. Because I see a lot of indications that some of the contacts we observe in other places, like in the World Congress of Families we talked about yesterday, the origin may actually be the Council of Europe, that this is where they meet for the first time and they identify like-minded groups in countries who, some parliamentarians would otherwise not have many contacts. So I think the Council of Europe is actually a much more central place than we tend to believe. Now, I've called this slide liberal language, illiberal laws. So what is the pattern? The Council of Europe will discuss a topic that on the first sight looks very innocuous and completely clear and no one can be against it. I mean, who can be against child welfare? And then you will see how this is interpreted into a very particular way in the Russian context, and how this is then sort of thrown back into the Council of Europe as an unintended interpretation. So in 2015, the Russian rapporteur at the Council of Europe brought forward a report on social services in Europe, legislation and practice of the removal of children from their families in Council of Europe member states. The author is Olga Bortsova. She is a member of the United Russia Party and a parliamentarian at the Council of Europe at the time. And so she presents this report, which is completely non-controversial, because it basically says that states have to exercise great care when removing children from families. So the report, I won't even give you the long quote, is completely uncontroversial, and it is passed with a majority. But what is the background to the report? The background to the report, obviously, is the debate on juvenile justice in Russia that started in 2010 and was still ongoing in 2015. And you may remember, so in Russian context, juvenilная justitia doesn't mean juvenile, what juvenile justice means in the US or in the English context, namely youth penitentiary system. It really means exactly that, so social welfare, how they interfere with families. And Russia was obligated by the European Social Charter of the Council of Europe to reform its system. And under Medvedev, this reform was brought on the way. And it was ready to be signed in 2012. From 2010 onwards, the church started to mobilize against the reform. And then in 2012, when Vladimir Putin became president for a third time, it stopped. So that reform never passed. And it was especially the Russian Orthodox Church, and at that time, Vsevolod Chaplin, who was still head of this commission for church civil society relations, who really argued against the reform and said it will lead to children being removed from children by state authorities on subjective and flimsy criteria, so insufficient level of material prosperity, low development, and so on. So a lot of I think lies were sort of put out on the intentions of that law. But what also happened is that Russian media started to report a lot about cases of children being removed from Russian families living abroad. So in Finland, there were a lot of reports from Finland, other reports from Norway, and every time the ombudsman for child welfare would sort of report. So you see that, going back here, wait. The report that the Council of Europe comes at a moment when in Russia there's a big debate on juvenile justice. And then in 2015, when this report passed in Russia, you had a headline in one of the newspapers, the Council of Europe supports Russia in its critique of juvenile justice. So it's being played back. And I'll give you another example for a very similar strategy. And this is, again, internet safety. Internet safety is a very obvious topic. And in 2013, Robert Schlegel, who is also a United Russian Party parliamentarian, brought forward a motion for recommendation coordinated strategies for effective internet governance, which includes, among others, the control of dissemination of extremist information, child pornography, malicious software. And the task should be the creation of legislation to prevent this. Again, this is, at the face of it, this is a very good idea. Who does not want to prevent child pornography on the internet? But what is really the background to that legislation in the Russian context? Among other things, and there have been many cases now, you remember the case of the YouTube blogger Ruslan Sokolovsky, who uploaded a video of himself playing Pokemon Go in a church in Yekaterinburg. He was charged with inciting hatred and offending the feelings of believers, and he was also convicted on bail in the end, and so he had a probation sentence after a lot of international attention also to the case. So extremist information can be defined in many different ways, and this is sort of again, I think we have to read behind the words of what Russian parliamentarians are promoting at the Council of Europe to actually understand what policies are intended. And I think we also have to see where these ideas come from. So there's an organization in Russia, it's called the League of Safe Internet, Liga Безопасного Интернета, and it was created by Konstantin Malofeev. Now again, here in Ukraine, I don't have to tell you who Malofeev is. So this oligarch who is now under US sanction because he said it was financed fighters in the Donbass area, and he is really a key figure in a lot of the phenomena that I'm studying as a sponsor of organizations and initiatives along the traditional. I say he is a sponsor, so what the organization that is the sponsor of a lot of these activities is the foundation he created, the Fond Vasilia Velikova. That's his foundation. And this is the foundation that channels the money and is sort of sponsor of a lot of initiatives. So in 2013, that's the picture I have here, 2013, this League of Safe Internet organized a forum, Безопасного интернета, and on this stage you see participants are Malofeev and Robert Schlegel. So the parliamentarian who 2013 then promoted this resolution at the Council of Europe. You remember that in spring this year, the Russian Duma actually passed a law that can potentially severely restrict free internet in Russia on the grounds of safe internet. Among the drafters of the law, part of the draft of the law was at least by their own saying, the work of the League of Safe Internet. So it's clear that this group has close connections to the Duma. But it's also clear that the group has close connections to the Russian Orthodox Church, because in April 2019, this year, Konstantin Malofeev became the vice president of the Всемирный Русский Народный Собор. This is an NGO, by their own saying. The president is the ruling patriarch, always, so at the moment it's Kirill. The headquarters are in the Danilovsky Monastery in Moscow, so it is inside the Moscow Patriarchate. And it is really a very right-wing organization by the ideas it promotes. What was striking for me, and I should say that before Malofeev, there was an interim period, but then the previous vice president until 2016 was Vsevolod Chapin, before he fell out of grace and changed kind of bishop. What is striking for me is that Konstantin Malofeev, who has clearly been involved in a lot of initiatives that are really in between, seem closer to politics than to the church, is moving into the center of power of the Moscow Patriarchate in the last years. So I found it very striking to see that he is now actually the vice president of this organization. Okay, and I give you another example, which is, I think, one that here in Ukraine you're very much aware of, because it also concerns very much on how the world sort of sees the autocephaly of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and what is happening in Ukraine. Now here the example I have is from Estonia, but because this is from before 2014, but now as Russians are back in the Council of Europe, we have a lot of cases like this for sure. So here again we had a Russian parliamentarian at the Council of Europe giving sort of an official written question to the Committee of Ministers on the situation of the Orthodox Church believers in Estonia, on questions of church registration. The Russian Orthodox Church created an organization, or let's say rather a website. They created a website, which is called orthodoxrights.org. I don't know if you've ever seen it or visited it. It's a website which is run by the representation of the Russian Orthodox Church in Strasbourg. So, Igor Philipp Ryabych, who you saw in the picture before. And it says it's a center for monitoring the rights and freedoms of Orthodox Christians in Europe. The mission statement is, again, very innocuous. So it says Orthodox Christians and other religious groups are vulnerable to intolerance, discrimination, and violence. And then the center underlines that it is not a call for special treatment for Orthodox Christians, but an attempt to encourage the Council of Europe member states to respect freedom of religion in general. The website is very professionally done. It works very much, it almost looks like the websites of similar organizations like Human Rights Watch, for example. So they have a section on constant reports, special reports, annual reports. You can search reports by country, by violation. It follows the human rights, the European Convention of Human Rights structure in identifying violations. And so it's a professionally done website. And since 2014, the website has basically become a tool to report critically on Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So all the reports, I mean, now I've just given you the recent violations here, they're all concerned Ukraine. And a little bit Kosovo, basically. So this is the work of that website. But again, what I think is striking is, remember this idea of the norm Enterprener. So this is a website that is set up by the Russian Orthodox Church that really reports on human rights violations in a very biased way. But at the same time in a very professional way and in a very central place also, because they're placed in Strasbourg and they're in the position to actually file these observations all the time. So and to come to a conclusion, so the Russian Orthodox Church, actors close to the Russian Orthodox Church and Russian foreign diplomacy act as norm entrepreneurs for moral, conservative and illiberal goals that these institutions are described. And I had this slash between the Russian Orthodox Church, actors close to the church, Russian foreign diplomacy, because really sometimes it's very hard to distinguish, you know, and to really understand who influences who, you know, where do texts originate? So they switch roles in taking the lead. And I think it's clear also that the human rights language is used, but in a conservative and illiberal key. And I mean, my interpretation is that this use of language is something that originates in the studies of the Russian Orthodox Church. So my guess is really that this is an expertise that goes maybe from the church into policy. But maybe you have a different vision of that, so I'd be interested to find out. I already said, so the Russian Orthodox Church has come a long way from 2000, when the social doctrine sort of rejected human rights as anthropocentric, to now becoming a very professional human rights entrepreneur in an illiberal team. But I also feel very strongly that the Russian Orthodox Church has gone a long way back to a type of Soviet-style control of the church, or of the church of the state, you know, who controls whom here, for government foreign policy aims. Because if you think about the Soviet time and conferences against nuclear armament, the peace conference, I mean, this in a way, this sounds all very similar. So are we just back to normal? Are we just back to the past, or are we actually, is this something new? So this is in a way the open question, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I know that all of you have some questions, maybe and comments, but we have official person who have the priority in this. Please, Professor Казанови. No. You're on program.
Well, I mean, for me the interesting question is, obviously those are valid issues. There are interpretations of human rights that may be contested on particular contexts, right? We know even the Catholic Church on some issues has also had arguments for a while. The very concept of gender was ideology. So instead of making clear distinctions, which aspects, let's say, of the sexual revolution, of the gender revolution are legitimate, enhance the dignity of the human person, and therefore should be supported by the church, which aspects of it are not, precisely because they are not. They do not enhance the human dignity of the human person, but basically lead to very questionable exploitation of the human person for all kinds of reasons, whether it is sex trafficking, whether it's... And of course, for me, the interesting question is the fact that Ukraine, in many respects, on these issues, also takes a very conservative position, and this is part of the tradition of Orthodoxy, even the Greek Catholic Church. But of course, it cannot side with Russia internationally. And this in itself also creates a problem for Russia, because Ukraine is a big problem for them. They cannot unify the Orthodox world precisely. I mean, part of the crisis of the Holy Council in Crete was precisely, it happened after Donbass and so on, and the conflict between the two patriarchates became more clearly developed because of that. So this is a crucial issue that also, to a certain extent, on which Ukraine will have to take sides, and the churches in Ukraine will take sides. And so the question is precisely how to not necessarily side with the liberals, with the conservatives, but to take a normative position which is based on principles, on church principles. The Catholic Church has had a very, very solid doctrine of human rights since the Vatican Council. Is the core of the principle of human dignity. And the argument, again, has been before, the Catholic Church used to have a third way, right? Third way between liberalism and socialism, third way. And they realized, no, there is no Catholic third way, there is no Catholic family, there's no Catholic state, there's no Catholic economy, there is only economies, states, families which are more or less enhancing of human dignity. And this should be the fundamental principle with which to judge practically any social institution, the enhancement of human dignity. And so, sometimes I myself am critical of the way in which on issues of gender the Catholic Church has been unable to precisely be able to differentiate which aspects of moral developments are positive, let's say signs of the times, as you bring in the conciliar language, and therefore part of God's plans on humanity, and which aspects perhaps are negative and should be contested. So I think that this is the kind of issue which the Ukrainian churches will have a way of distancing themselves from precisely the Russian Orthodox Church on these issues internationally, but not only because it comes from Russia, but because one should take moral and normative positions which are based on really serious principles instead of basically simply defending an authoritarian, conservative, basically anti-European agenda, right? Anti-European Union, trying to basically, again, create a context of conflict of nation against nation, within which, of course, then the Russia can intervene more freely. So it's part precisely of this package of the Russian project of going back to becoming a crucial actor precisely in European debates. Let's not forget that it was the Helsinki Agreement, right? And which, for the sake of leave us alone, right? Do not criticize us. We accept this principle of human rights, and they were afraid, of course, of intervention, and we accepted no borders should be changed militarily, right? So it was a quid pro quo. We accept your human rights discourse, but you accept that you're not going to try to change the Soviet Union. Then, of course, the Soviet Union fell apart precisely without changing of borders, and it was fundamentally precisely a result of the Helsinki, right? Europe has decided that after spending 3 centuries changing borders, fighting nation against nation, Europe should become basically a place of peaceful collaboration in which no regime, no government could basically change borders by military force. And then, of course, we have Crimea and Donbass is the first time right after the Helsinki Agreement in which those things. So this is all part of a general project of Russia to bring it back itself into the policies of Europe, and we see how there is a coalition. On the one hand, you have, in Italy it's very clear. You have old leftist groups that are still nostalgic of the old Soviet Union, who are pro-Russian, because they are pro-Russian. And now you have these conservative groups that because Russia defends traditional moral values, then we are pro-Russian. And we see very clearly the whole discourse in Europe is totally debt to Ukraine because all the discourse is pro-Russian. So you have in Germany, very clear. I mean, fundamentally the press, the European press, the media are ultimately, and the whole issue of the autocephalous church is basically a pro-Russian position. The Ukrainians are the ones creating trouble. They use violence. They don't respect the freedom of the Orthodox Church. So those are crucial issues, and I think it's very important that Ukrainian actors, both religious and political and social, on the one hand stand for whichever principles they have, normative principles, which maybe in some ways contest some interpretations that come from advanced, let's say, liberal Western countries, but yet not to have this whole, not to take this whole package in which precisely we are going back then to a situation in which basically human rights doesn't mean anything because ultimately the state itself controls the whole structure, and so to present Russia as a defender of human rights abroad, and the fact that it presents itself internationally as such, it shows how, basically it's almost incomprehensible. So the important thing is to be able to discern which aspect of the policy is, as you put it, there are legitimate arguments that can be made on many of those issues, but the way then it is taken by the Russian state and the Orthodox Church and turning into a whole denial of the European Union, of human rights, in the name of, again, state sovereignty, in the name of the traditional values of the traditional church, becomes a very problematic condition.
Thank you, Jose, for bringing this Ukrainian perspective. Would you like to react, or?
No, I just want to say that I think the Vatican also has no way out.
Yeah.
Because I had a very enlightening interview with the Vatican diplomat in New York who said, well, the Russians are kind of taking over the family. That was on a family issue, and we are not at all happy with it.
Yeah.
So they've taken the lead on the family issue, and there are a lot of Catholic North American NGOs like Alliance Defending Freedom and so on who go with Russia on this, and causes a lot of.
And the whole issue of religious freedom has been now done. Yeah. Basically, religious freedom is now a way of attacking the whole discourse on gender rights and same-sex marriage and so on. So it's an important issue, but you shouldn't do it to radically change the discourse of human rights. So, Ivana.
I have been very confused.
Like Vatican.
First of all, I have a question. Why did you pick the word entrepreneur for a church? It's a synonym to businessman, isn't it? Why did you pick this?
In some,
a church is an entrepreneur. So it does business with moral norms and human rights. Second question I would like to put, it's not a question, it's rather a reality. There's a completely, I think, different vision, a different interpretation of human rights in the West and in Russia, which are covered with the same words: democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And for example, they proclaim freedom. I just came from this conference again, where Bishop Vert, a Roman Catholic bishop, who is also ordinary to the Greek Catholics in the Russian Republic, in the Russian Federation, and he said there are 25 Greek Catholic communities and at least 20 priests serving, and they're hanging in the Luft. They're in the air. They don't know whether they're legalized, tolerated, or whatever. So human rights. They even have a beautiful church. I just forgot the name of the city where this beautiful church is. So then we have a new situation in the Vatican since the death of which you know very well. Pope, now the same Pope, John Paul II, new communism, and the Ruski Mir quite well. And they weren't happy with him. Before the fall of the Union and after the fall of the Union. Pope Benedict was a great professor, but a very unhappy pope. He suffered as a pope. I can never forget when Cardinal Huzar left his first audience with Pope Benedict. He told me privately, Ivan, forget about our patriarchy, forget about everything. We'll have to wait for another pope. This new pope knows Ukraine from two sources. Father Stepan Chmil, who he knew as a child, who was his confessor and spiritual father, and who was he served when Father Chmil would celebrate liturgy in the Eastern Rite. His second source of knowledge of Ukraine comes from Sviatoslav, his beatitude, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, because he served in Argentina and Africa. Basically, this Pope is regarded as a man who is not knowledgeable. It's not nice to say about this, about a Pope, but we're in a free, restricted group, and I think we should conclude that. He is I am an Enterprener. Well, I can speak freely. I'm already 72, and he is not regarded as knowledgeable in Eastern Europe affairs. I will add, I travel often to Rome and Italy, besides Ukraine. I am surprised how many members of the Italian hierarchy, cardinals included, not to speak about priests, are anti-Papa Francesco. For the simple reason that he tries to solve the problems with these marriages, the question of, abuses, and the usual question is, why is he stirring all this, I don't want to use the bad word, mud, let's say, with these issues? Regarding Ukraine, it was a big discussion. You should read, because it's available on the internet, all the interventions of this conference. It's on the ccaa.eu, including mine, on the Havana Declaration. I said it very freely because our bishops were afraid to say this. The Havana Declaration, the Havana meeting was done without adequate knowledge of Sviatoslav and our Ukrainian church. A lot of people, it was this continuous race. When will the Pope meet with the Patriarch of Moscow? You remember, it was still Alexis. Okay, so what I see a big confusion. I see a Russian Orthodox Church who now is very powerful because it has so much money. Billions of dollars, billions of euros, and they feel at ease to do anything. And I'm returning to what I said yesterday. If we do not receive support, humanly speaking, we hardly stand a chance. It is in the hands of God and how things might develop, or in the true human rights issue, in these people who have the guts and courage to defend them in this regime of Vladimir Putin. I have given you questions, but it's a very sometimes frustrating situation when you're in these dialogues and you have the knowledge but you don't have the means to stand. And everybody, this is fascination in fashionably Moscow, which I mentioned yesterday. Also, okay.
Thank you. Maybe you can bring
No,
us more up.
it was not optimistic.
You live in Italy.
I live in Italy.
You live in Italy?
Yeah, in Florence.
So if you're,
No, I thank you for the input and also the Jose. I mean, I'm not optimistic either because I think what we see is a real polarization. So Russia is a real, another social science term like Enterprener, a norm polarizer. And they're extremely good at doing it. Extremely good. Yeah, and I think what's happening is an ever greater polarization because, of course, how does the other side react? So the progressive human rights side. On the progressive side, it's also the more extremist groups that prevail because they heighten their tones as well. So all
in the United States, very clear. In the United States, very clear.
Yes,
and it now penetrates in every institution, the Supreme Court, the Parliament, the President, now the Vice President. So it's a really,
And I mean, I think again, I put the map back on because what you see on this little on Europe here, so the dots are civil society organizations who, in this context of resolutions, also submit statements. And what is really noticeable is that inside the EU, a lot of NGOs supported the Russian position. This is, for example, in like the Romanian Alliance for the Defense of the Family, or in Italy, Nova Terra, like this kind of organizations that are run by sort of more conservative Catholic groups, French groups, Romanian groups. So civil society, in that sense, you see a polarization also inside the Europe, obviously European countries.
Why this Canada and Sweden and?
They were not members in the period because it has their rotating membership.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Please, Pavla.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. That's the question of the historical nature. How different is what is happening now from what was happening in the 1970s? When the Soviet state and Russian Orthodox Church and all sorts of ecumenical platforms, like World Council of the Churches, was advancing the peace agenda. So I remember even when John the 23rd Pope published his Pacem in Terris, he was criticized for buying communist narrative. So what's new?
Well, that's in my mind. I mean, I'm not a historian, I only know this history from books, and I mean, there's one very good book by an Italian scholar, Adriano Roccucci, it's called Stalin el Patriarca. It doesn't get translated, unfortunately, into English, but I mean, the way he describes the political control of the Russian Orthodox Church at the time, and
Filaret knows the system very well. Filaret was a perfect instrument of the system.
And so was Kirill. I mean, Roccucci's book ends in the 70s with the arrival of Kirill in what he calls the school of Nicodim.
Exactly, yes.
Yes. So this is, I think, there is a clear personal continuity. And in terms of ideas, really, on the human rights issue, I have a very strong sense that these ideas grew out of an inner church discourse and moved into politics. Because in the late 90s and also in the 0 years of 2000, under Medvedev's rule, the Russian government did not have an interest in the conservative human rights discourse. So this, I think, really...
It's only with the second presidency of Putin that the Eurasia ideology basically disappears and the Ruski Mir is taken over as the new ideology of the state. So in the first Putin presidency was an attempt to develop an Eurasian ideology away from Europe, and now it's a Ruski Mir to go back to Europe precisely with this.
I think that this is important because this allows to make the narrative more complex. We are used to speak about Russian Orthodox Church as an instrument in the hands of the state. Here you have clearly almost vice versa.
Because a state that wants to remain an authoritarian state, but doesn't want to have their own Stalinist ideology, communist, right? So it's an anti-communist, it's an anti-revolutionary state, right, for a status quo, and they need a new conservative ideology, and they find it in the church. So
may I?
Yes.
Just few words to that what Pavla said. But then we have a question: who is the church? Who are the church leaders? Where or they come and which school they visited before they became bishops and another posts? This is I think also a very interesting question that we should think in this context. Okay.
I want to say that it was in 1978 that Cardinal Slipi told me you should follow the developments in the Russian Orthodox Church. And you know Dr. Horbach, we had a network in West. It wasn't large, but we did some work. Now, after, let's start from Alexei I. Okay, he was the Stalinist and so, but then came Vatican II. And Borovoy played an important role, one of the delegates. Then you have Nicodim, the phenomenon of Nicodim. Do you know that Nicodim, every time he would come to Rome, he would visit Slipi for at least 90 minutes. They would exchange. Usually Slipi was known the big anti-communist, anti-Moscowski Patriarchat and all that. It was not true. Now, you remember the Furov report, where he divided into 3 categories: completely loyal, people who would entrepreneurs, and then first it was still quite a poor church. It was completely controlled, but there had also bishops, Teodosi Poltavsky, for example. It was a classical example who spoke of the freedom of the Russian Orthodox Church. Let's remember that after Vatican II, even the Russian Church, who was also considered ultra-conservative, permitted in exceptional cases, just like the Catholics did, the communicatio sacris. Even with mixed marriages, or when you can't go to church on Sunday, you can go to the Catholic Church, even receive communion. We discussed this recently. Then came Pimen. Once again, as long as Nicodim was alive, Nicodim was, one day before his death, he was with Slipi. And I mentioned that audience in one of my articles. And so there were people who had the courage to say things. The problem today is it's a powerful church and a very wealthy church, very rich. And this is a very dangerous marriage. Power and money is a very traumatic marriage. And it's not good for the church to be rich. I know. I spoke recently with nuns from Brazil. He said, the poor orders are having vocations. They're wealthy teachers and don't have them. So I think that morally speaking, the Russian church today is in a worse situation than it was in the times in the 70s and early 80s. May I just say about the ecumenical dialogue, because I really...
maybe
I
know that you know a lot of different things.
We basically don't have problems with other Orthodox churches, slightly yet Georgians. But then comes Hilarion Alfeyev and he says, we are the largest church, we are the wealthiest church. Without us, you can't take it. And he leaves.
Hilarion has been, but again, you said this
I mean, that's the Italian word.
But what is Hilarion is precisely the symbol already of the foreign diplomats, the Soviet foreign diplomats that were very well versed. They knew the Western system very well, but they could turn the system around.
But you know what really strikes me so much is that how this kind of works, and in a public opinion also. I mean, yesterday I talked about an NGO called the World Congress of Families, which is a pro-family group. I didn't talk about it today, but what you really see there is that this mystification of Russia as the protector of family seems to work. And there's an audience in the West, especially in the United States, that takes this at face value. And I mean, if you actually look at the legislation in the countries, actually including Ukraine, where, for example, surrogate motherhood is legal, and it's illegal in all Western European countries, or in Russia it's also legal, it really completely makes no sense, right? So, so Russia is presenting itself as a defender of the family, you know, as someone who stands up against these extremist developments of same-sex marriage and so on. Whereas in reality, it's not like that. And what I think is also really frustrating is that the reality in Western European countries, which is in many cases very differentiated, you know, there are a lot of policies are in place for the protection of the family and so on, and the European countries end up voting, for example, against family issues, where they do much more in terms of state subsidies policies for the family than the countries that vote in favor of the family. So the world somehow is no longer, it's upside down.
Yeah, sure.
Just to continue, what you have just said, but could you offer some explanations, some reasons why does it work? Because, you know, why people don't understand that Russia, as we said, delegitimizes actually, let's say, reasonable conservative agenda and discourse and hijacks it. Why people, what works that they don't get it?
I think what we are witnessing at the moment is really a redefinition of the story of the Cold War and of the confrontation between the West and the communist East. Because what we see now today is that these actors successfully managed to say Brussels is like the Moscow of the Soviets. The liberals today are the Bolsheviks of the past.
Yes.
And so I think for a lot of people, the big confrontation between left and right, socialism and fascism, that's a political language they still understand, right? And what is happening now, and I think you see that very clearly in Italy, is that the communists of the past, that's the liberals of today. So who is in favor of women's rights, children's rights, same-sex marriage? You know, that's like, you know, that's what the Bolsheviks did, and now this is what we have, what they are trying to do in Europe as well. So I think in Europe they are appealing to a story that is very deep in our system. So I think we aren't through the post-communist transition yet. You know, I think and why? So where does this story come from? I think it comes from the U.S. And this is something I learned myself, because as I started to look at this material, I learned more about the United States and where the culture wars in the US between liberal and conservative values was always discussed in terms of communists. Only that we think that sort of they are both, in the US, both groups are political liberals in a way. They were both remote Democrats after all. But as this discourse is now entering into Europe, it's actually really reshuffling the spectrum of debate. I hope I've been clear, but maybe I think you understand. Maybe you can put it in your terms once again. I think it's really about retelling a story of the 20th century.
It is the question that the European countries don't want to remember what the European Union was about. The European Union was about ending the war between France and Germany, right, after 70 years of war, and ending the war between Protestants and Catholics. These were the two reconciliations that came together with the Christian democratic parties. Germany was Protestants and Catholics, and it was the French Catholics that initiated the process, already coming and offering peace to the Germans. This is completely forgotten. Nobody wants to talk of this precise idea of Europe as a reconciliation. No more war. Basically, curtailing national sovereignty for the sake of the common good of Europe. It was a Catholic project, that's what it was. It was all, no Protestant country joined the project, least of all the UK, no northern country, the only one was Holland and Germany because they were the bi-confessional countries, and in both cases it was the Catholics that were the leaders. In Germany because most Protestants had gone. This story has been forgotten. The socialists took over the project of Europe, and again, an issue of solidarity, of common welfare. Now these two transnational projects are gone. Europe has no idea anymore what to do with itself. It has become a club of wealthy countries that only works as long as there's no crisis. But we saw the moment there was a crisis, solidarity ends, and the northern countries begin attacking the southern countries, and now this want Brexit out, etc. So in this context, already of people that have no idea why should there be a Europe, comes then the Russia, and people that are dissatisfied for whatever reason, right? Conservative Catholics who are dissatisfied with the Pope, and because they're fighting their own culture wars with their more liberal secular country, the French. Probably the French Catholics are the ones most open to this discourse. They are the ones precisely that are really fighting what they see the collapse of values in France. And I saw it, and there saw when we had the conference in the conference we had on war in Ukraine, and all the French Catholics were there. They were pro-Russia, and they wouldn't want to listen to any critique of Russia, right? So it is a combination of context in which they're all exactly, but it is because the socialists themselves lost their leadership on economic issues. When the economic crisis came, no socialist party knew what to do with it. The socialist party in power lost power. The socialist opposition, none of them knew what to do. And basically their argument has become, the Spanish Socialist Party was very clear. It's all on gender issues, cultural issues. And so now you have then...
and international solidarity, so the refugee crisis.
And so you have precisely now the response of the others that respond against what the leftist parties have become basically defender of these new gender values, and this is a fundamental problem.
Very good now. Yeah. Okay. You have more questions or some?
Well, this is very important what you said.
Yes.
Victor, please. Victor's
Question: What are your forecast predictions?
No, I don't have, I mean, it's, at the moment I'm overwhelmed in a way by all this evidence and this material, and I somehow, as a scholar, I see my task as kind of, I want to write a book now, where we just, together with a colleague, we lay open in a way what we found. I mean, I think we really see an emerging, let's call it network, for lack of a better word, of conservatism, or for illiberal conservative political aims and values. Russia plays a very important role because Russia is really an important sponsor, also in terms of money for these initiatives. And
blackmail.
Yeah. And so I think this is something that is important to kind of be put out there as also as a scholarly research, not in a journalistic way, but really as a piece of research. So that is where I see my task. And what really drives me in a way in normative view is what I said before, that I think there's a real risk that something is taken away from us in our way of understanding the world. Like the vision they put forward is very, very powerful. And it has already changed the European populist right parties. There we see that they've really changed. The Lega Nord of Salvini, the Austrian FPÖ of Strache. I mean, you know, I didn't like these parties before, and I don't like them today. But what happened is that they were sort of socially quite progressive liberal parties. They were not against gay rights, for example. And I mean, now they have taken upon themselves this: we are defending Christian Europe, and this really worries me, you know, as a Christian. I think, like, you know, that's something that's not okay. So this I find very troubling, and I honestly feel that why have they done that? Yes, of course, as a reaction to Islam, but not only. So to explain it only through the Islam opposition to Muslim migration would be not sufficient. I think we also have to remember this other story, the one we just analyzed, that this is very much about old confrontations between left socialists and conservatives in Europe, left and right, east and west.
Okay.
I think it is very good that we have some time to discuss on what Jose just said, because of paramount importance. Europe was created, EU was created to stop war for good in Europe after the two traumas of the two world wars. The fathers of Europe were Schumann, De Gasperi, Adenauer. 3 Catholics. Okay, let's leave the Catholics out. It was for to end the controversies between Orthodox Catholics and Protestants and stop the war between the French. Then we started to speak about the common market. Then the Brits were interested. I lived in England then. And it was, when will we become members of the common market? Because it was profitable. And I reminded my British friends, today you're talking about Brexit. Then you were keen to get inside, and you were frustrated that de Gaulle said, no, we've had enough of you. And as you said, now Europe doesn't know what to do with itself. So, and what you mentioned, we should discuss this. This is so important. AfD in Germany, from whom are they taking most votes from? The Christian Democrats and the Christian Social CSU predominantly are going to the Alternative für Deutschland. The same with Le Pen.
East Germany and
Yeah, also. Le Pen from the Gaullist party. And then you have this Larange, or whatever his name is, this who's for Brexit in Great Britain. The Conservative Party is expelling a Churchill. Can you imagine that? Where have we arrived? Then you have in Italy the same thing. Trump is not interested in Europe. I have been telling this our Ukrainian friends. We should stick to Europe because we are in Europe. And we should start dealing in euros, not in dollars. Here still everything. I don't know why this is the case. So there are so many elements, and then there is this laicization, which is threatening the church. The West has no vocations. We are closing churches in Germany, in Italy. You know this perfectly well. Once Ukraine will get more orderly, peace returns, and we get wealthier, you will see what a crisis of vocations we will have here. We are still covering all these, more or less. But this
I'm not convinced of that because
okay, we can.
economics
It's another topic.
That's another. But still, the situation is getting very. I mean, Europe doesn't know what to do with itself anymore.
But it's a different topic, right? No, but it's related because only in this way the propaganda can make sense, or the way it's taken only because of the crisis. There is no other story. We simply have no story, and this is it's a question of narratives.
Yes.
But it is surprising that Russia is still much afraid of the European Union.
Of course.
They are less afraid of the United States. That's far away. They're afraid of the European